Welcome to another Mobicon Academy session. We're here today with Lennart Nout, my colleague, and myself, Babette Hendricks, both working as consultants at Mobicon. Today's session is all around the Amsterdamsestraatweg, a study tour that we filmed for you with our 360 camera. And Lennart will take us through the ASW. Today's objectives are to discover the strengths and weaknesses of Dutch road design and to understand why road design should be changed and transformed if the road's purpose is changing. We'll have like 4 sections today, so we'll start introducing the Amsterdamsestraatweg to you by describing its history. Then we'll do the study tour with the 360 camera. We'll move on to protected intersection design intermezzo. And we'll conclude by discussing what the future holds for the ASW, because we think the Amsterdamsestraatweg can be better or should be better. So the ASW, we didn't choose it randomly. We chose it because it used to be one of the main roads in Utrecht, and it has transformed throughout time. The ASW was an assignment given by Napoleon Bonaparte, who wanted a straight and direct route from Utrecht to Amsterdam. So the route is entirely straight. There are no curves, no bends, because he wanted to build the most direct route as possible. So he wasn't content with the existing roads, so they developed this new road. In Utrecht it's like 5 kilometers, but it continues all the way to Amsterdam. You see the arrow pointing out the Amsterdamsestraatweg, the ASW, and throughout time we see that, well, first of all, the development occurs along the Amsterdamsestraatweg, and as time passes, we see that Utrecht starts to grow on other sides as well, and that new infrastructure is developed. So the big red lines in the map indicate that there are highways formed along Utrecht. And as this happens, we see that the ASW moves from this arterial road where a lot of businesses were located and where trade was centered, that this changes and that the purpose of the Amsterdamsestraatweg becomes more to, well, go into the residential areas and no longer is the center of business. And you see it also disappearing gradually into the map. So you can ask, so guys, why are you discussing the Amsterdamsestraatweg?
Because it's a troubled street or road. As Babette pointed out, it used to be super important. It still carries a lot of cars, about 12,000 a day, and a lot of bicycles, about 20,000 a day. And you can imagine that that's a lot of functions and a lot of claims on space on a pretty constrained corridor, because obviously the width of the street hasn't changed much with the growing number of people traveling through it. At the same time, there's still quite a lot of retail of a different size and scale as it used to be when it was more of a prestigious street. It's not very prestigious retail at the moment. There's a lot of supermarkets. But it currently also holds the title for being the least safe street in Utrecht. And now you might think, why are we looking at the least safe street in Utrecht? Shouldn't we be looking at the safest street? I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the design of the Amsterdamsestraatweg. There are some really good aspects and some really transferable designs that you can implement in other cities and other countries. But there are some real challenges, and I think it's good to tell the story about how your street design should transform with the change in use, and how you can learn from the things that are not going well in the Netherlands as well. So first, to get to know the strengths and weaknesses of the Amsterdamsestraatweg, we're going to take a 360-degree bicycle tour. I took the camera out on a nice and sunny day, because it always looks a little bit better in this grisly summer. And I basically rode from what's almost my house to a train station, which is about an 8-minute bike ride. We start out in a residential area, where we see a pretty standard residential street, some funky street design going on, and then we turn right onto the Amsterdamsestraatweg and we ride it all the way to the protected intersection, where we'll have the protected intersection intermezzo. I'm going to keep that one. And then we're going to turn left at the intersection and ride a few hundred meters more towards the train station to look at the bike parking situation at the train station. So with that, we're going to turn over to the 360-degree camera. So we start today's tour with a little ride through a residential street that's one of the side streets of the ASW. Here you can see a modal filter that has been installed in the last few years. This modal filter just allows bicycles to pass through, as you can see, with a nice little bollard in the middle. It was quite contentious placing these modal filters in the neighborhood between the ASW and the bigger arterial road on the other side. Because this allows people to not travel, or it doesn't allow people to travel through the neighborhood. So people were very upset, where am I going to park my car, on which side of the modal filter, and how am I going to get to my house? All being said, it was implemented and it works very well, because in the current situation there's no through traffic through this neighborhood at all, which makes these streets very safe and very comfortable to live on. Now we continue to a meeting of two residential streets, and you can see a little feature on this side, which is the driveway configuration, as we call it, where cars that exit the road on opposite us have to yield to all the traffic on the cross street. Pretty steep ramp, and as you can see, the cars really have to slow down to traverse the street into the other residential street. Now, this is one of the funniest streets in the neighborhood, which probably has the worst street design I have seen in a residential street in a long time. As you can see, they've designed this street in a way that allows cars to park with two wheels on the road, and then they placed a series of bollards to protect a tiny little pedestrian strip along the front doors of these houses. But it is the Netherlands, so people have to park their bike somewhere. So this is exactly the spot where you're going to park your bike, making the whole footpath useless to pedestrians, so everybody walks in the street, which is not necessarily a problem because there's not that much traffic, but the use of this street is really, well, doesn't suit the design. And all these cars look stupidly parked with two wheels on the footpath. So we keep going and we enter another driveway configuration, because they wanted to limit the traffic on this little terrible street. So here's another driveway exiting onto the residential street. And now we enter the Amsterdamsestraatweg, or ASW, with again that same configuration. So this is very ubiquitous in Dutch street design, where the transition is from one street to the other, and you want one street to yield. And we always put in these bricks, or these pavers or ramps, all precast concrete, so you don't have to place them, you don't have to pour them on site. But it really highlights the transition and makes you yield to all the pedestrians on the cross street in this case. Then we turn right onto the cycleway, and this is where you can see how the street really operates, with a median strip and random pedestrian crossings at different intervals. What we can see here is the pretty standard cross-section of the ASW. You have a footpath, which is not generous, but about 2.5 meters wide. Then a cycleway, which is about 2.2 meters. Then a parking strip, pretty, well, relatively narrow for modern fat cars. Then one drive lane either side, separated by a median island in some spots, and sometimes it's just painted markings, and then the same on the other side. So it's very symmetrical, but it is making the most of the available space. It even has some space for trees in between the parked cars, which I think is a really useful feature. Putting trees between parked cars really narrows down the street, even if there's no cars parked there. And that's a very big contrast with a parking lane, for example, which means that if there's no cars parked, the road just looks very, very wide. And then we continue on towards the north. And here we enter one of the tunnel under the railway. But as you can see, a nice feature is that the cycleway stays basically at the same level, but the car lane really dips down to allow for higher vehicles to traverse the railway overpass, but the bikes don't have to go as deep because they're not as high. That doesn't mean no trucks get stuck here. Sometimes it does happen and it looks ridiculous, but for most large vehicles this is perfectly manageable. a lot of sun. And then we come across a series of filtered side streets. So originally this used to be a normal street, as you can see, with access to the ASW at some point, but they put these bollards in to only allow bikes to have access to the residential streets on the side. Cars can access this road, as you can see, the parking, but they have to go around and enter from the back, from the other arterial on the other side. They put some speed tables here because there is a serious problem with speeding on this road, which we'll get to later on in this tour as well. Then a contentious issue in some countries, the floating bus stop. This is a pretty narrow example, but it does have all the features of a floating bus stop. You can see the signage here and even a tiny little shelter, but the rest is a narrow platform of about 1.1 meter wide with tactile strips, so it does fit all of those, or it ticks all of those boxes. But people can cross the cycleway at any stage without any trouble. So again, for a very tight cross section, they really make the most of every centimeter. Then we get to another side street entrance. Here cars are allowed to cross into the side street, only in, not out. And as you can see, the cycleway is very continuous. Unfortunately, no red asphalt on this street yet, which would highlight the cycleway. And that is probably one of the things they would fix if they would fix up the street, because it does help making that crossing more visible. But the same kind of treatment with a ramp up for cars, crossing into the pedestrian and cycle realm, and then landing back down into the side street, which is obviously made out of bricks, and into the residential environment at 30 kilometers per hour instead of the 50 at the ASW. And here you can see also the narrow median, which is just painted in this instance and not raised, because people have to cross into the side street from both directions. Then if you are a cyclist and you want to turn left, there's little turn-off bays provided to access the side streets on the left. These are little details, but they're very important in making sure that cyclists can access all of the residential streets as they please and not make it too difficult or too dangerous for people on bikes. You can also see that there's intermittent car parking, bike parking, and planting in the parking strip, or the mixed-use strip, as you can call it, which is a clever way of making the most of the available space again. And here you can see a car coming from the right, yielding to us because they're crossing into the arterial road. Now we keep going for a little bit, and then we get to a pedestrian crossing. Because of the high volume on the Amsterdamsestraatweg, or ASW, some of the pedestrian crossings are priority and some are not. This one, for instance, does not have pedestrian priority, which in my view is an oversight, because I think you should always have pedestrian priority on this street. But they've chosen to balance and only give pedestrian priority at those locations which are the busiest or the most important for pedestrians. So some have a crossing like this, where there is a median island of decent size, so you can cross in 2 stages, so you don't have to cross the whole street in one go, but it doesn't give you any legal priority or right of way. And that's a choice you have to balance between a number of cars you can move through this street and the number of pedestrians that can cross. Also something that might change in case of a redesign. Now we cycle a little bit further, and here we can see 2 cyclists coming in the wrong direction. And that's one of the challenges that you have with a street that's relatively hard to cross. People choose not to cross the street if they want to go against the flow of bike traffic for a short stint. They'd rather just cycle in the opposite direction. Can cause some problems, because you can imagine with 20,000 cyclists a day on this street, it gets very busy in rush hour in particular. And then sometimes it's better to build bidirectional cycleways on either side of the street. But in this case, obviously, there's not enough space for that. So they chose to do unidirectional cycleways, better for safety at the cross streets, but sometimes it means that people will cycle against the flow of bike traffic on the cycleway, which clearly is not a huge safety hazard for bike-on-bike crash, but can be annoying for cyclists mostly. And there's a lot of grumbling cyclists when people do this in rush hour. Then we get closer and closer to the large intersection that we're going to get to. But first, we enter this little side street that has a traffic light, actually. And that's basically to allow people to turn on and off the Amsterdamsestraatweg, because in rush hour it gets very busy, so it's very hard to enter and exit in some instances. So sometimes they put a traffic light there, not for safety, but to manage the traffic flow, as we always say. And here at the bottom, you see the markings or the cut in the asphalt, and that's the bike sensor that senses the bicycle and allows you to get green earlier at the upcoming traffic light, so you don't have to push the button, for example. And here we see the traffic light in action with a permissive right turn, so bikes and cars have green at the same time, which I think in this case is really bad design choice, because you can see what happens. A lot of people get really anxious because there might be a car behind them. They want to get off the road, they want to turn right, but there's just an almost constant flow of cyclists going in the same direction along the ASW, and that causes some real friction or concern with all of the road users. So car drivers feel uncomfortable turning right, cyclists feel uncomfortable with the car driving and turning across their bike lane, and it's a pretty bad outcome for all, especially given the lack of buffer space between the car lane and the bike path. So there's not a space for cars to pull out of the flow of traffic before they turn right. So this doesn't really meet the design criteria that we have set for ourselves here in the Netherlands. Then we carry on. You see a little bit more of the same design elements that we've seen before. So a mix of bike parking, sometimes not enough, so people park their bikes or scooters next to the trees, which is okay. But here you can also see that the place function of the street is really, doesn't quite suit the space. A local shop wants to show their wares on the footpath, but it leaves very little space for pedestrians to walk along the street here, which means that there's more needs for space than there is actually width available. And here we can see we enter a slightly different environment. The street widens out a little bit. It's because of this new development, newish development that was built with a little bit of setback, so it creates a little bit of breathing space for the street. It's a bit of a retail center with a supermarket behind this building and a few smaller shops. And this is also where they put the bus stop. So that's a nice feature. If you have the space, you can use it to make it better for everybody. So the bike lane's a bit further set back, so there's a lot more space for a bus platform, and you can see it's about 2.5 meters wide. So much more comfortable bus stop for people waiting to get on and off the bus. So that's nice. Also creates that buffer space, and for example, a left turn bay here is a bit bigger, so you can actually fit a whole cargo bike even in the buffer space. Unfortunately, the space has run out again, so we go back to the narrower cross section further down. Yes, now we get to quite an interesting point. This is where they also have put in place traffic lights to allow for that right turning and left turning traffic. But in most of the time, these traffic lights are turned off because it's deemed not busy enough or not important enough to leave them on. In which case they'd rather have them off for safety, because if people don't rely on the traffic light but rely on seeing the other road users, they actually behave much more carefully, and it gets safer for everybody. So you can see there's still continuous bikeway, continuous footpath. All the cars from this side street need to yield to cars, bikes and pedestrians. But for right-turning cars, there's the same problem that we saw before, the traffic light. Not enough space to turn off, and you have to cross a pretty continuous stream of cyclists in rush hour, which gets very stressful. I've done this once in a car, and it was not pleasant. So try and avoid that if you can. More bike parking. There's another supermarket on the right, bit of a shopping area again. Loading zone here for the bigger supermarket here. So there's even dedicated space for loading sometimes, but it's obviously taken out of the car parking, and out of the bike parking is maintained. Another pedestrian crossing, a little park. Yeah, and some greenery even, which is not very common in this part of town, which is nice. There we see one of the menaces of the ASW, the scooters. They're a little bit too fast, they're a little bit too wide, and a little bit too noisy for the street. Especially if you have 20,000 bikes a day, it gets very busy. And then if you have scooters that try to overtake at about 30, 35 kilometers per hour, they become a real nuisance. I wouldn't necessarily say safety hazard, because it's not, you're not really going to get killed by one of these. But they are fighting for space with cyclists. So the current plans are to move these mopeds and scooters out onto the roadway and lower the speed on the roadway to 30 kilometers per hour. And that's going to happen citywide. And then that will really create some extra breathing room on the cycleway eventually, when they do it, but it's going to take a little bit of time. Here you can see another widening of the cross section, basically, a little parking area / square with some food trucks. And this is again where they've done the same treatment, widen the platform for bus passengers, put the cycleway behind it, bend it out a little bit, create that space, create that breathing room, and then everybody can get along nicely. Here is another supermarket. You'll be surprised at how many supermarkets are within 400 meters of the ASW. There's 2 of these Albert Heijns actually within, there's 4 Albert Heijns within about a kilometer of each other. They really like their own competition. And this is where we get to the large intersection, the signalized intersection, where we'll get into some of the design elements of, watch out for the tree, of the protected intersection, and we can see it in real life. So we'll go to the stop line, and then while we wait for the red light, because obviously it was a red light, you can see it just turned red. We'll go and discuss the principles of this protected intersection in the protected intersection intermezzo. Welcome to the protected intersection intermezzo. That was really fast. As you can see in the cycle tour, we ended up at the intersection, and we're currently waiting for the light, which is a great time to look at the intersection design. This is an aerial photo of the intersection. We've just come in from the bottom. Yeah, right for you guys at home. I think it might be left. I don't know. And we've been cycling. Can you see my mouse pointer? We've been cycling up to the first traffic light to wait to cross before we turn left. And that's exactly the first principle of a good protected intersection, that it has a free right turn and a 2-stage left turn. And you can see that in practice. We're currently doing the 2-stage left turn, where you first wait at the number 1 in this image. Then we're going to cross, and then we're going to wait for traffic light number 2 before we get to continue our way. Now that might sound like a nuisance for cyclists, and sometimes it is, but if you phase it well, so if the order of the light phasing is done to benefit cyclists, then you can get the green lights quite quickly following on from each other, which reduces the waiting time for cyclists. And at the same time, if you want to turn right, you don't have to wait at all. So that's design principle number 1 for protected intersection in action. Then the second one is improving the sight lines between between cyclists and cars. As you can see, there was a little car turning right across the bikeway, but at the angle between the car's trajectory and the cycleway was pretty close to 90 degrees, which means that a car driver looking out of their right window could actually spot the bikes waiting at the traffic light or trying to get across. So that reduces the chance of a crash happening. Then the most important bit of a protected intersection is the vertical protection, or the corner island. This particular corner island is almond-shaped, but sometimes it comes in the shape of a banana. And you can see it here in the image and on the aerial view as well. They all have a light post in them, or the signal post, which is quite useful because that really stops cars from going over or cutting into that corner, and it physically protects the cyclists that are waiting at the light from any right-turning cars or cars going straight and not being very good at driving from hitting them. So that's an important feature. Then another important feature you could see is riding up to the stop line of the intersection, and that was quite far ahead of the stop bar for cars. You can see in this cutout from the video, the cars were supposed to stop at this white line, in the big white line in the front, while cyclists can ride all the way to the smaller white line in the back. And that means that when it's red and a car sits at the stop line, they can really see cyclists in the corner of their eye. And because the light phasing at this particular traffic light is pretty bad and cyclists going straight and cars turning right have green at the same time, it is extra important that drivers are aware of any cyclists coming through so they can anticipate stopping and yielding to cyclists going straight at the lights. Not necessarily the recommended treatment. Ideally, you would not have right-turning cars and bikes going straight having green at the same time, but in this instance it was necessary for car flow. Then another feature, the raised median, a little bit hard to see maybe in this image, but there is a tiny little median strips in all directions. So there's a big white line on the image, which is a raised median, but also on each approach there's an island that physically stops cars from traveling across that line. Very important for left turning or right turning vehicles, because they cannot transgress into the opposite lane, which means that their turning radius is a bit tighter, and that reduces the speed. So that's speed reduction, which means that if something goes wrong, the chances of injury are reduced. And with that, we're gonna carry on with our route. We're gonna turn left and we'll pick it up from the second traffic light, so the left-hand turn. So we're at the second stage of a left turn. So we're waiting for the green light, which will, I check this, will be soon. You can see the bus coming by, and then we're gonna get a green light and continue our tour, which is we turn off the Amsterdamsestraatweg, but we're gonna head towards the suburban train station and show you some of the bike parking there. So you see we got green now. Unfortunately, the cars behind us will also get green, and you can see that some of these cars will try to turn right across the cycleway because they have green at the same time, which is not recommended necessarily, but it is again a car flow constraint. Now you can see a very different cross section here. This is it's part of the city ring, as they call it, a 4-lane arterial, pretty fast, with a crappy little fence between the bikeway and the traffic lanes. No greenery at all, not even a street tree, and a very narrow footpath for what it is. Luckily, there is plans to downgrade this to a 2-lane cross section, which will happen in the hopefully near future. But you can see that for a car turning right off this street, there's really no space for any buffering at all, which makes it quite dangerous and also very uncomfortable for drivers and cyclists alike. So something really needs to change in this cross section. Also, you can see no median between the 4 lanes because there was no space because of the high traffic flows and because they wanted to facilitate so much car movement on this road. And there's clearly a lot of speeding issues, air quality issues, and unsafety issues for all road users. So watch this space. This will be downgraded to a 2-lane arterial, which creates a whole new environment and a lot of extra space for greenery and better traffic safety. Now you can see here that all of a sudden we changed from a unidirectional bike lane to a bidirectional bike lane, which is basically only to facilitate movements toward this side street and to the other side of the road. To have cyclists avoid some of this street, they actually created a bicycle street down here, which is all the way at the other side. But to allow for that movement, you have to have a section of bidirectional cycleway. So while it's pretty narrow, it hasn't even really widened from a unidirectional. It's only really used to get to the other side of the street, to avoid having to cross this monstrosity twice. Now, this overpass is actually a train station, so it's a suburban train station. It's not super busy. It only caters for sprinter trains, which is the local trains, but it can be a very useful link towards a few destinations in the region, and that's why there's also some bike parking at this location. It's pretty well integrated between modes. You can see the bus stop right underneath the train overpass, then the stairs up to the platforms. On the other side, there's also an elevator. So the transition from bike to bus or other way around is pretty seamless. And the same goes for bike parking, because obviously most people would travel to the station by bike, and they have a few options for bike parking. Here, some covered single layer bike parking all the way to the end. On the other side, there's bike lockers as well. They're a bit hard to see from this angle, but you can rent a bike locker for €100 a year, I think it is. And you have a dedicated locker with a key. So if you have an expensive e-bike, you can park it there for a fee. And that concludes the study tour of the Amsterdamsestraatweg. And now we'll discuss some of the plans for the future of the street and how we can make it safer for everybody.
So we've seen how the ASW is looking right now, but maybe it's good to zoom out a bit and see what the place is of the ASW in the bigger picture to discuss what the future holds for the ASW. Utrecht is currently working on the car dependency. They want to reduce the car dependency of the city, and we have to go back in time to see what they've been working on the last decades. As the car demanded more space in time, so we're in 1968 right now, Utrecht, the city of Utrecht decided to give the car more space. So this water was replaced by a big arterial road next to the central station, which is very close to the ASW. But throughout time, we saw that this wasn't durable for the city on the long run. We wanted a more livable city. So the city of Utrecht decided to transform it back to water and make it a greener area and a nicer area to stay and to be in. And the cars have been moving out. But if we look at the mobility plans the city of Utrecht has been making, we see that they point out the ASW as a main cycling route, and they want to reduce the number of cars on the ASW. But what do we have to do to accomplish that? And next to reducing just the number of cars, we are talking about improving the livability and the traffic safety for cyclists, for the growing number of cyclists on the ASW.
Yeah, so there's multiple ways to address this challenge, which is a really complicated challenge because, as you saw, we have 12,000 cars a day. They don't just disappear overnight. The plan is, or the expectation is, that it's going to reduce a little bit over time by itself. But to really make this a livable street and a safe street, something more rigorous needs to happen. And there's basically two options you can do. One is to look at the network and try and work with the network to find ways to reduce the number of cars in the ASW. And that means you can have a cut further upstream or downstream, for example. So one of the plans that the city is currently working on is to create a cut in the through traffic at that signal, or the water that we saw earlier, which means that there's fewer demand for cars driving on the ASW, which is just north of where this cut is going to be. So the hope is, or the expectation is, that will reduce the number of cars. But there's other ways to do that as well. Tinkering with the traffic lights upstream, so letting fewer people turn into the street, which physically reduces, more of a soft cut, as we call it. Can lead to a lot of frustration with drivers, but can also be very effective. And there's then other ways, more rigorous ways that we could have cut the through traffic around the ASW. One of the proposals is to actually physically cut the ASW in half and don't allow any traffic to travel from the southern point, or here the corner of the city center where we are, all the way up to the intersection with the traffic lights that we saw in the study tour. That would be obviously a very effective way of cutting the through traffic, but it generates a whole new set of challenges, and some of the traffic will be displaced to other streets there where residents may not be too happy about having extra cars on their road. But as we saw, those network changes are necessary, and they will happen one way or the other. But that still leaves us with some design challenges, because it's not going to be a car-free street in the short term anyway, and it's still going to have a lot of bicycles. We still have to work with the existing cross-section. And that means that the city is also looking at various design options. One of them is reducing the speed to 30 kilometers per hour, which is going to help because it will have other options for infrastructure. So cobbles, for example, will slow down cars. Taking away the bike lanes might be possible. Creating a bicycle street has been tested. But with 20,000 bikes and 12,000 cars, it's going to be a very busy bicycle street. So it is also not necessarily the option. So we don't have the answers, which is great. We don't have to have the answers. But we do think that in design and network, real changes are going to be required to make this a nice, livable and more green street that it should be, and bring back some of its former glory. So we hope this has been a helpful study tour. Thanks, Babette, for hosting us. And I hope you can learned something from the design elements that we do recommend, but don't build a copy of the Amsterdamsestraatweg at home, because you might have some trouble.
Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video on the ASW, you can like and subscribe or visit the website academy.mobicon.com. See you next time.